What if I told you there was a game before PlanetSide 2 back in 2012 that was capable of reaching hundreds of players in a battle zone and had combined arms combat that featured infantry squads and vehicles too? Well, rightfully so, you would be quite confused, because not many even know of a title like this even existing, partly due to it being only released on PS3, and the other part due to its relatively low shelf life, dying at just 4 years of life. That's right, we're talking about Massive Action Game, that dropped that moniker and simply became MAG. MAG featured 3 different factions all at war with each other and hell-bent on domination, with maps filled with a whopping 256 players, making it a 128 versus 128 affair with varying objectives and an RPG-like progression system. MAG, which launched on the PS3 in January of 2010, was one of a kind, way ahead of its time, and that came with its benefits and negatives. Although MAG was a revolutionary title, it sadly wasn't able to garner nearly as much popularity as the prior SOCOM series that it was built from in some ways as inspiration. And within a couple of years, not only would MAG have its live server shut down, Sony, the parent company of Zipper Interactive, the developer behind MAG, would shutter them altogether. This makes MAG an interesting story, not unlike another story that we've covered, Dust 514, a story of a pioneer being relegated to a single console, the PS3 in this case again, and even after all these years still commanding respect from the player base, and even those who didn't play it. Why did MAG die and find itself in the Death of a Game series? A series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to a game or company's death or dying, utilizing a timeline of events filled with clues, developer testimonies, and most important of all, detective intuition. This all culminates in a final deduction, where we as classic detectives do, crack the case for good. You know, in case any of you missed the clues along the way. Without further ado, detectives, we have a case to cover concerning a massive action game. The story begins with the success of the star of this case, Zipper Interactive. Zipper Interactive was an interesting company located in Redmond, Washington, and founded back in '95. While they had some humble beginnings, they would handle the third MechWarrior game to some great success, and then follow that up with a super underrated arcade flight game in Crimson Skies, being based on the board game of the same name. But no success was like the success that Zipper would encounter when they would unleash the SOCOM series upon the world starting back in 2002 and becoming a quite regular affair for a good 6 years after. The SOCOM series, full name SOCOM US Navy SEALs, would be a PlayStation exclusive synonymous with the console, a tactical third-person shooter that not only featured a lengthy campaign but also multiplayer, for which it became the first game that allowed for the usage of the headset for the PS2. You could even command your squad by issuing commands with that microphone. I might anger some people with this statement, but I think that SOCOM was like a third-person Rainbow Six, a shooter that was more about utilizing a squad to defeat numerous enemies, usually outnumbering you. The SOCOM series, though, would sell over 10 million copies in total, becoming so successful it would attract the attention of their publisher and platform king, Sony Computer Entertainment. Sony would acquire Zipper Interactive in January of 2006 and would promise more to come. Zipper was a dream for Sony. Not only could they move units in the way of games and consoles, they could also sell Sony-branded headsets, making them a very useful money-making resource for Sony. Zipper Interactive would go into development on 2 major titles at the same time, one being a new title in the SOCOM series naturally, and the other, the main character of this show, MAG, or being known as it was first announced back in the summer of 2008 as Massive Action Game. Massive Action Game was a shooter that would allow for a whopping 256 players to play online in the same game. This would be accomplished by having 8-player squads, each fit with a captain who can command the squad as they see fit to accomplish the objective that varies depending on what game mode you would play. These squads would then complete objectives separate from each other before combining for the final assault and defense sequence together. Besides just having a player count that nobody was really capable of at the time, they would also allow character progression that would allow players to level up and customize their characters, making MAG more like a shooter with RPG elements, which is probably why it gets called an MMO FPS a lot of the time, but really it was just because it was really sounding like a game like no other. More details concerning what would mostly become known as, just for short now, MAG, would be revealed April 2009. This interview with the game's production director Tony Iupa would highlight how MAG was about tactical squad play in a large-scale shooter, what you can see in this interview, which is probably why it became what the wiki page and many others incorrectly state, because 256 players isn't massive in the context of an RPG or even in any massive virtual world or online game, but absolutely is massive in the context of a shooter. That's the whole idea that MAG was an MMO or somehow inspired by them. Meanwhile, in this interview and other interviews, Tony never actually states this. He just only mentioned MMOs at all, talking about the community aspects of it and wanting to learn and borrow from them, which is kind of a generic throwaway that many developers would say at the time. MAG still absolutely, however, was looking noteworthy, MMO or not, and I and many other players had caught wind of it through Sony's marketing and were eager to try it out. The first chance players had to do this was during the game's beta, in August of 2009. GameSpot in their hands on the game during this time would dive deep on the game's progression system, which allowed players to level up, earn skill points, and create your own class. As the game also featured a skill tree system. The squad leader position, for example, or officer position, is only available to players post-level 15, and leaders then serve both as passive and active buffers on the battlefield, a remix on the Battlefield 2 system. The launch for MAG, on the PS3 only by the way, came January 26, 2010. MAG had no shortage of coverage, being advertised by the platform holder and entertainment giant themselves, their parent company Sony. It would reach a critical mass of 83 critical reviews on aggregate review website Metacritic, scoring a 76 out of 100, which was a good score, and nothing to scoff at when you consider how ambitious the game was trying to be. Game Informer and GameSpy would score MAG the same, at a 70 out of 100, with GI stating that although MAG had an impressive player count, the game felt like a rather mechanical experience, failing to stand out from the pack due to an uninspired world, ultimately labeling the game quite generic. GameSpy would claim that the game was incredibly confusing as a multiplayer experience, but that they enjoyed how teamwork focused the game was when compared to other shooters online, especially for the time. I personally think that MAG has the perfect sort of reception for the kind of game that it was. As I agree with Game Informer here, MAG's tech was nothing short of widely impressive, but the rest of the game felt so generic it kind of hurt. Starting from the sound of the game, which was forgettable, and that's a sin in a shooter, extending to the factions of the game.
So they've relied on the private armies, these three factions in the game, which are Sever.
Factions that even the lead game developer couldn't remember when speaking to press. But there's three factions in MAG, as we spoke about at the beginning of this case. One being the Valor faction, who are essentially a mix of the UK and the US, and are based in Alaska. Think like Army Bros. Then there's Raven, who's this European outfit based in Austria, though feature personnel from all over the East. These guys are, tech nerds for some reason, with little combat experience apparently. And then finally we have the Sver, or SVER, which is based in the Chechen Republic, and are battle-hardened soldiers with less resources. If these all sound quite incredibly generic, and like they have no visual identity at all, that can be inferred from their lore. Well, I think you're right. They did come with their own unique attacking and defending maps, which added some more variety to the game, though that was curtailed a lot because all maps in MAG were mode-specific, greatly reducing the map pool. Some attacking and defending maps were also just better than others, making some matchups amongst factions really unbalanced. Speaking of game modes, starting with Suppression, which was a 32 versus 32 TDM mode essentially, then you have Sabotage, another 32 versus 32 mode, this time with a set of objectives needed to be completed. Acquisition is the closest thing to a Capture the Flag game mode, where players must capture 2 prototype APCs behind enemy lines. Finally, the game's flagship mode, Domination, featured the huge 128 versus 128 battles, which was double the scale of Battlefield 2042 from 2021. And this game mode was all about a large series of objectives, think of kind of like Conquestin'. The game mode was fairly complex, actually. Well, in theory. The actual design, due to how Zipper Interactive had to kind of manage things, ended up being a bit sequestered and rudderless in ways, as it felt fairly tame because they had to essentially, up until the final sequence of the game, divide all those players, so you never really got to see all of that scale, something that would happen with later titles, of course. Talking about the actual combat and gameplay in MAG now, starting with the combat, which was easily the weakest part of MAG, and look, I'm gonna be honest here, I've never been high on the SOCOM series. For a tactical shooter, it felt like it was light years behind Rainbow Six to me, and the guns just felt like cheap fireworks half the time with no impact to them. And trust me, I've been playing milsims since Arma 1 was a thing, and also Operation Flashpoint. This is repeated here with MAG, as although not third person anymore, the gameplay was still this very odd feeling mix of more fast-paced shooter with a strategic tactical one. Now to be fair, I liked the combat in MAG more than SOCOM, but it wasn't anything that was going to be winning a Best in Slot award. And when the base gunplay isn't very good in a shooter, that's obviously a pretty big mark on the game. But the gameplay otherwise in MAG was unique, besides just having massive amounts of players involved, because it allowed for a progression leveling system, where players could unlock new skills and benefits. This even extended to leadership abilities too. Sure, this might feel very Battlefield in some ways, but in this case, MAG was classless, and was more like an RPG in that sense. The other problem with the combat in MAG wasn't the infantry combat either, it was the vehicular combat, which honestly looks and plays like a random full makeover mod I played for a previous game or something. Vehicles look cool, but handle in incredibly arcadey fashions in one way and then like massive boats in another. All of which, the vehicles by the way, in terms of ground vehicles are basically just APCs, or armored personnel carriers. Which was cool, but if you're going to be compared to PlanetSide 1 on the PC and Battlefield on all platforms that both had loads of vehicles on the ground besides just one type, it wasn't going to look good for you. They showcased tanks in the trailer, but the game had no tanks to speak of by the way. Air combat exists in the game too, though the AI is the one piloting the helicopter, and you can merely just shoot from it. Which felt like something, but not a total combined arms experience which was sort of being sold. Even parachuting as a concept for infantry was done automatically, for example. But it's like all the concepts were there, but the ideas weren't totally fleshed out yet, or in their sexiest iterations yet. A major summer patch would hit for MAG, dubbed patch 1.06, and would fix the team kill glitching and spamming that players were doing to exploit and just, well, be annoying. Which was kind of like the worst part of MAG online, honestly. The first DLC would drop for MAG June 2010, and would be dubbed Interdiction. This DLC would cost $5 or be included in the MAG starter kit, which would cost $15 and include 2 other character slots, because that was previously prohibited to play other factions besides your one character. This update would introduce 3 new maps, though these 3 new maps are because of each faction getting their own version of the map for the mode, and then a new game mode, Interdiction. This game mode was a 64 versus 64 person game mode, and a very objective focused one where players would capture and hold 3 neutral bases, sort of kind of like a capture mode territory from Halo or something. APCs would also heavily be revamped, as they were the primary and almost only vehicle in the game now, allowing for passengers to fire upon enemies as well. An interesting concept, but seemingly a bit of a band-aid. The next patch would be a major one, patch 1.07, set for the fall in 2010. This patch would allow for all suppression or sabotage maps to be attacked by all PMC groups, which seemed like a no-brainer. But to be fair, the idea MAG had was kind of cool. With each faction having their own maps they had to learn and master, and being able to attack and defend on them as well. The problem being you have a small map pool that's even smaller now because it's not a dynamic map pool, so people are going to get bored faster without enough variety in the game. There's also not enough about the map or factions that make it unique, which is kind of like the whole selling point. There's a reason that mode-specific maps only really work if you can repurpose maps into multiple uses and not just for like a singular mode, unless it's like something like training. The biggest update to hit MAG yet would drop September 30th, 2010, and was titled the 2.0 update, or MAG 2.0. With it would come a level increase from 60 to 70, a revamped buy menu and ecosystem, and the ability to deploy as a clan, and, well, finally a revamped skill tree. The issue with 2.0 wasn't really anything to do with the patch itself, it was pretty good. It was instead about how slow it took to hit live, as at the time, you had some fierce competition for the game, like Black Ops, Bad Company 2 for Battlefield, and Halo Reach, which were dominating the shooter world and selling millions of copies. Battlefield Bad Company 2 is one of my favorite games ever, and one of the best Battlefields I would say. Not only did it have the classic Battlefield experience, it had something MAG didn't, destructible environments completely, in many cases, and a single player campaign. And it was a good one at that, just like all the other shooters I just mentioned. So MAG, when compared to its competition, wasn't that competitive. The second DLC, if we aren't counting some of the smaller packaged ones, would drop November 4th, 2010, and with it would come a new game mode, Escalation, complete with a new set of maps as well. This pack would run for $8, though offer a discounted rate for those who purchased the previous DLCs too. This just wasn't a good era for live service or DLC, really, not yet. I mean, Battlefield Bad Company 2's DLC was the Vietnam DLC, which plays like an entirely new game or campaign in a new story and location. Halo Reach's DLC was giant map packs, and some of them were like classic ones that people loved, like me. the value offered here just wasn't quite there and competitive. And bundling game modes and maps together might seem like it makes sense in terms of content, but I find it to be a weak selling point because if someone doesn't like the new game mode, they're not going to get the benefit of the new maps anyway. It also further divides the game's population because, whoever doesn't have the DLC is not able to play those maps. A huge patch would drop the next year in February of 2011, dubbed the patch 2.11. Which would free up the rest of the map pools to be played in different game modes in the way of faction neutrality. This, alongside the multi-queue system being introduced, would certainly help with quality of life and matchmaking, but MAG had a serious problem. While 256 players is dope if your game doesn't have a lot of players, that's not many games possible at that many players, capiche? And while we can't track any population data, as MAG was only on PS3, but I doubt that it was a good thing and speaks to the game's lack of success, more so than its success. The last patch MAG would drop would be in March of 2011, and it was so small it basically only addressed a movement issue with the DualShock 3 controller. And this might seem like a sudden thing, but when I explain what happened next, it will make all the sense in the world. And that's because SOCOM 4 would drop April 19th, 2011, and this SOCOM would not only be the worst rated in the series at 67 out of 100, which is even worse than the PSP game Fireteam Bravo 3, which many of you probably didn't even know existed, and while sales numbers weren't released concerning the new game, it is estimated to have sold well under 1 million copies by a considerable margin, also making it the worst selling game in the series too, especially as a mainline title. I don't think SOCOM 4 was a horrible game though. It had great visuals and some interesting ideas, but the fact that it wasn't very tactical and played more like a COD shooter kind of hurt the game, on top of dropping near the PSN outage of 2011, which persisted for 20 plus days, so it wasn't a small thing. This circumstance and failure, alongside the abandonment of MAG seemingly, with its only live servers just remaining with no new updates since SOCOM 4 dropped, would lead to major layoffs at Zipper Interactive in May of 2011. Sony would then afford Zipper a year, seemingly to improve matters, or perhaps to make their amends, and would then shut the company down altogether, April 2nd, 2012. Sony would express that MAG service would remain live following the closure, though there were no promises of how long. The 17-year-old Seattle-based video game company who managed to find a niche of tactical shooters to succeed with would be shuttered altogether. The remnants of the team would go on to form and be part of many major video games, like Ben Jones becoming a lead designer on Battlefield ironically, or Ed Byrne, the game's creative director, becoming a design manager on Marathon, which only just recently launched, as of 2026. And many more successful transitions, proving that Zipper Interactive wasn't short of talent, which explains how they were able to deliver something like MAG so far ahead of its time. MAG continued on for another year before finally having their live server shut down as well, as it was only being left alive in a maintenance mode state for 2 years, July 16th, 2013. MAG was a trailblazer in the make games bigger realm, a realm a virtual world and MMORPG fan like myself is quite interested in, of course, even in the context of combined arms shooters, like MAG. But that trailblazer blazing the trail first took a few wrong turns and found themselves burnt away without anything left to go. A scenario all too familiar on the series that is a constant reminder. Being first isn't always the best. MAG would essentially die for the next 12 years, before, suddenly in the end of 2025, when the news in the MAG subreddit would drop and shock what little of the community remained. Because user Watso28 figured out how to make MAG playable offline utilizing a PS3 emulator. While this was a far cry from the true beauty of the game, which was the massive player battles playable online, it was something. And in the world of game preservation, a realm I wholeheartedly pledge myself and my cause to, sometimes you have to take the little victories before bigger victories can come, if they ever do come, since there's no guarantees. Still, I'm quite proud of the MAG community and how they were able to even get the game playable again even if it was just offline. Shout out to that dope gaming community and their quest to keep their favorite game alive. And besides just for preservation or even just nostalgia purposes, the reason it's important is it can still remind players and developers that this already was possible before, and maybe that we'd like to see it again. But the case here has come to an end, detectives, with MAG being officially shut down alongside the parent company and still not being playable in multiplayer as of 2026. The music is playing, which means it's time to deduce this case, detectives, with the clues we've already gained along the way as the timeline has been unfolding and as the events terminated. And so, why did MAG die and nearly completely fade away? It was a pioneer in more ways than one. Lackluster based gunplay. It was a PS3 exclusive. Lackluster world and lore design. The game was abandoned. The parent company shuttered. Massive action game. It came and it went. But with it came the idea that shooters could reach more than we ever thought possible. A number we thought only MMORPGs could reach, and now these days, survival games. But MAG still manages in 2026 to boast a player count and game design that is incredibly unique and interesting. Sure, these days we have a lot more strategic or tactical shooters, though more in the military sim-like lens like Squad, Arma, Reforger, and Hell Let Loose. Even amongst these shooters, none are able to capably, reliably hit the 256 players that MAG hit back in 2010. That leaves MAG in the conversation of being a pioneering and still one-of-a-kind experience. And that's why I had to cover this case, PS3 exclusive or not. Thanks for watching, detectives, and let me know in the comments below your thoughts on MAG and why it ultimately failed to take charge. And stay tuned for the next case. It's one of my favorite gaming series ever.
Or on the last great journey, fair.
Let me not then die ingloriously and without a struggle. But let me first do some great thing.